And on today with Hannah Cox, one of my favorite libertarians, which may not actually mean much because I only know like three of you weirdos. How are you today?
You avoid us most of the time.
I try to.
I kind of do the same thing with libertarians, so I'm in the same camp. No, I'm joking. I'm doing great. Good to see you.
Hey, likewise. So 2022 was kind of a crazy year, capped off by a $1.7 trillion omnibus spending bill. So it looks like the biggest winner of the year was big government. I don't know.
Isn't it always? I feel like they always win every year. Come hell or high water, they're going to find a way to get their money, get the bag, and they did it yet again. So we were following it pretty closely at Base Politics leading up to the vote. I think it was sort of the usual round of cronyism and just random funding for studies and money going overseas. And, nobody reads it. Nobody has any idea what all is actually in it, but just skimming through it, picking out the highlights. There's plenty of things to be upset about. There were a few silver linings. I do a lot of work with a group called the White Coat Waste Project, which is an animal welfare group, but they're a free market based animal welfare group. And they really just care about getting the government out of torturing animals and gain of function research and things of that nature. They're actually who exposed a lot of the COVID funding, but they had some wins in there where we actually did defund some gain of function research in foreign enemy labs. So there were some things to be happy about here and there, but overall it was definitely not a win for the taxpayers.
Yeah. So, and I think the big concern that people have is that I think most people on both sides of the aisle seem to revile this excessive government spending. We do this every single year. There's some sort of omnibus bill at the end of the year. What does it mean for America, or how do we restructure our society so that politicians actually start paying attention to the needs of their constituents and do what their constituents want? Because nobody wants this.
Yeah. Well, I think this is the point you and I somewhat agree on. I say I'm a libertarian, and I am, but I'm not even affiliated with the Libertarian Party. I'm really very independent. I don't like the party system at all. And I think the two-party system is the root cause of the problems, right? Like almost everything that people talk about in the culture, almost everything you see the mainstream media going back and forth with, it's all bread and circuses, right? It's panem et circenses. It keeps the people thinking that there's a difference between the parties, thinking that they have a vote, thinking they have a voice. And at large, you don't. And at large, your representatives don't, right? They don't even allow your rank and file congressman to add amendments on the House floor. They don't even get to read these bills before they vote on them. They show up. Party leadership says, this is how you vote. You either vote that way, you either fall in line, or you don't get to be on a committee, or you don't get your funding for your primary. They run somebody against you. And so basically you can go on TV and talk smack and you can spend your time fundraising, but it's all for show. You have largely people playing politics on TV for you in DC, and most people don't really have a voice. And that won't stop until we break the two-party system. It's really as simple as that.
Yeah, I meant to do a video on this a while ago because it's our system is set up as a sort of this weird duality. It's like a binary system with reinforcements everywhere. You got the red team and the blue team, Democrats, Republicans. You got Coke and Pepsi, AFC, NFC. You got Bloods and Crips. You know what I mean? It's just everywhere, and it's no more evident than in politics. But how do we break out of this system and get a third party candidate as a viable option when the system itself is set up? When we look at debates, when we look at in terms of the support you get from media establishments, et cetera, how do we get third party candidates or independent candidates a serious look when across the country we have multiple states that have structural systems in place to prevent third party candidates from even having a fair shot?
Yeah, I'm really glad you bring this up because I don't think most people recognize it, right? They always say, if people really like libertarians, they get more of the vote. Well, no, they can't get the vote because it is rigged, right? And it's not just against libertarians, it's against any third party candidate, any independent, and it differs state to state. But in Tennessee, where I worked for the longest, you'd have 25 signatures to get on the ballot as a Republican or a Democrat. You had to have a third of the number of the people who voted in the last governor's election, which was something like 35,000 signatures to get on there as anything else besides that. And then even if they did go and raise the number of signatures, which the LP did do one year, the Secretary of State can just arbitrarily throw half them out and say they don't qualify and give you no explanation, and you're still not on the ballot. So I hate to be a Nancy. I don't have a lot of faith in getting third party candidates elected. I think the most expedient pathway to breaking the two party system is through things like ranked choice voting. And I also think it's through getting involved at a policy level and really starting to hone in and build coalitions at the state and local level and at the federal level where you can. But that's how I've gotten most of the bills passed that I've worked on in my history. I still see a lot of potential for that. And I think the encouraging thing is that when you start working on the ground, people aren't as far apart as you think they are, right? You really see the loudest people in both parties representing them online and on TV. But if you talk to the average person, we largely agree on the problems we face. Healthcare is too expensive. Schools are broken. Our kids are getting dumber. These basic kind of things that everybody recognizes are going wrong around us. We just often don't agree on the solutions because we're not having conversations. But if you sit down and you start talking to people, which I did, I would go deep into Memphis and I would start working in urban communities and really trying to talk to people about the school system. And they got it immediately, right? And they were like, school choice. Never heard of it before. What a great idea. They were on it and they started to get involved. Or you talk to them about occupational licensing reform, getting rid of business taxes. A lot of people are, they're hair braiders, they're cosmetologists, they are barbers. They deal with the oppression of the state, and these people like sending in weird investigators to find them and catch them. And they understand how hard it is to actually be an entrepreneur. And so when you come in, you have ideas about getting the state out of their lives in that way. They get it. And so you can start to build these really broad, diverse coalitions and really get things done pretty expediently. And you kind of just step out of the two-party system. But I think that's where we have to get people to. It's recognizing that, you can vote all you want, but you're not going to vote your way into liberty, in my opinion. I don't think that there's really that much hope for that. I think the real work has to be done in actually advancing legislation and people starting to recognize that as a whole, when it comes to the big important things, which are spending, which is the military industrial complex and war, the two parties are on the same team. They're not actually fighting each other on these things.
So how do you get conservatives on board with something like ranked choice voting when we just saw them get a curb stomping in Alaska and a lot of people are actively campaigning against it?
Yeah, I've heard this from conservatives a good bit that ranked choice voting doesn't favor them. I don't know. This is kind of a thing to me that is sort of a turnoff from the right, where increasingly it seems like the right's narrative is you need to limit people's options and limit their ability to vote in order to win. And to me, that says, well, it sounds like you have a losing strategy then, because if that's your plan, if you need the masses to stay away in order to win, then you're not running on the right things. And I think that is the problem with the right now. I think the right is running crazy people as a whole. I think they're running really unattractive people who are talking about things that do not matter to the average person. And I'll give myself as an example. Like I said, I'm an independent person. Like I'm rarely going to go support a Democrat. I think I voted for a Democrat once in my entire life, and that was against a truly bat-wing crazy person on the right. But as a whole, you're going to have to convince me to come support Republicans, right? Like, what are you offering me? And the more the right moves away from the things that have actually made it great, that have actually made it a strong counter to the progressives on the left, which are free markets and individual liberty and a truly limited government, the less and less attractive it is. And so I don't think the problem is with ranked choice voting. I think the problem right now is that the right is not speaking to the masses and really where they are, and to a lot of independent-minded people and to younger people. And I think that that's a sad reality, because I think if they were to return to the principles they have espoused for most of my life, they could, because the left is going straight off a cliff, and people recognize that. And people don't want this anti-capitalist BS. They know that that's a failed ideology. They want a strong answer. But when you've got people like Josh Hawley running around here sounding the same as Elizabeth Warren, it's really hard to convince them that you've actually got, an opposition option over here. And so you see a lot of people sit home. The person who actually won the vote in 2020 was none of the above. More people are sitting home than going out and actually getting involved these days. And I think that's actually a problem with the messaging and the representatives.
Yeah, so you brought up limited government as a core founding principle of, conservatism. It's supposed to be something that we champion on a daily basis. Some things that we've seen recently, though, are that a lot of our institutions are being weaponized by people on the left, and we have people on the right calling for the same thing and saying, hey, rather than limited government principles, we need to exercise the power of the state once we have it to punish our political opponents, just like they've done to us. Do you think that's a solid strategy?
Oh, man, I think it's the most short-sighted strategy I've seen in a long time. And I've never understood this. If we give the government any kind of power when you're in charge, that same power will ultimately always be used against you when you're not in charge. And that's not going to be for long, because as I mentioned before, the popular vote, the numbers are moving towards the left because we aren't offering a strong counter over here. And I think that just, it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I don't like what Twitter has been doing. I don't like what Facebook has been doing. And listen, I make my bread and butter off of these websites, right? Like, I'm dependent on these algorithms, on not being shadow banned, not only to make my money, but also to get my message out and to really achieve the work I'm trying to achieve. So I really detest the ways that these companies have been limiting viewpoints on the right. But to come in and say that the answer to that is to then use government to come in and squash the companies, when the government is the one pressuring these companies to censor in the way they're doing in the first place, makes no sense. I think that the Republicans are missing a huge opportunity here to really go after the actual bad guys, which are the agents and the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security and the CIA and the Biden administration, and even the Trump administration, who are breaking the law, who are breaking the Constitution, who are telling these companies to censor people and take away their First Amendment rights. I can't understand for the life of me why we don't see a large coalition on the right coming in and taking these agencies to task for that serious violation. And it's a violation against us, the users. It's also a violation against Twitter, right? Just because the old administration went along with it, that doesn't mean that everybody there wanted to. And I've really seen this narrative on the left lately of like, well, the FBI didn't make Twitter do anything. They just kind of suggested it or said it would be great. And it's like, no, when you have a government agency with all the power of the state behind it, when you have sitting politicians on Twitter threatening the owner of it with the FTC and coming in and using antitrust and using regulations to break it up, suggesting something is a threat. It's an implied threat that if you don't do it, we will then come in and use these powers against you. So companies fall in line because what options do they have, right? And that's what we need to see the right start providing is true recourse for people to fight back against this kind of thing and to go after the true bad guys here, which is, again, the government.
Yeah, I think one of the things that Twitter files have exposed is that the FBI essentially, well, Twitter actually sort of functioned as an FBI field office. It was a very close connection, revolving door of staffers between the two organizations. But especially with conservatives holding a slim majority in the House, I mean, what steps can they really take to hold them accountable when they don't have any real federal power right now?
Well, I mean, we could see things in the states happen, right? And instead, we've seen it go the opposite direction in places like Texas or Florida. We've seen them pass content moderation laws that target the companies instead of actually passing resolutions to go after the federal government demanding answers. And are those things binding? No, but they're symbolic. And I think if you start having a lot of people speaking out against this, then you would have some pressure on Congress. And I think that the left should have pressure applied to them as well, right? Like this happened to people who live under Democratic representatives as well. And I think that if people started to really raise their voice and push back on it, then I would hope to see some Democrats join in on this, because while, again, it was weaponized against the right for now, we know it's been weaponized in the same manner against the left in previous generations, right? It wasn't social media, but back then it was them threatening Martin Luther King Jr. and telling him to kill himself, or they were going to reveal his affairs, or it was them going after people that they thought were communists and trying to take away their businesses. It's often been used against either camp. And I would just hope to see some consistency at some point in recognizing that government power will, even if it's not being used against you right now, you have to speak up for your enemies, your political enemies, when it's happening to them, because it will ultimately come for you. And we used to see that from groups like the ACLU. We used to see that when we were talking about true defenders of free speech, where the ACLU even defended Nazis, not because they in any way had any empathy for the Nazis, right? They detested them and made that known, but because they recognized that free speech and other civil liberties, they don't get taken by going after the popular class first. You lose these things because you go after the quacks, right? You go after the QAnons, you go after the Nazis, you go after the people that nobody really wants to defend because they're so gross. But when you let that happen, the precedent is then set and it comes for you. And so I think that case needs to be remade to Democrats these days. And I really think that as a whole, even at the state level, we need to see pressure applied to lawmakers to demand answers on some of this and more investigation into it.
One of the things that I noticed this year is that there seems to be a big shift in terms of voting trends. And part of why the red wave didn't materialize is the vote of 18 to 29-year-olds. They sort of got discounted. It's a huge voting block. And if they show up in 2024, it spells disaster for Republicans. But what's the best way to sort of message to that class of voters?
Well, I'll tell you right now, I spend a lot of time on TikTok, which is where a lot of that class of voters is getting their information, getting their news. And I see very few people on there with me who are pushing back against like the top algorithms on there, which are very far left, which are very much communist driven. As you expect, China owns this app. But the point is, this is where American youth are often getting their political news. And so what I see on there most is this false perception that the problems that they are dealing with, and they are dealing with problems, right? This generation is getting the brunt of the COVID shutdowns. They had to enter the job market in the middle of this. They are buried in student loan debt oftentimes. And I get it. I'm a little bit older. I'm a millennial. But I too sort of had that feeling coming out of college where I was taught you do X, Y, Z, you work really hard, it equals this, right? And you get out and you start doing that and you're like, I'm not getting ahead. This isn't working out for me. I can't afford these basic things that I thought I'd be able to afford at this point in life. And if you don't understand economics, you don't understand what the government's doing, it's really easy to look around and say, well, I guess I live in a capitalist system, so this is the fault of capitalism, right? And instead of blaming the true culprits, they're blaming the business owners, they're blaming the economic system they're under. And so they're starting to vote for the left. But the reality is that the actual culprits for this are the infringements into the free market, the attacks on capitalism by our government. And I think that there's a really strong case to be made with that generation to help them understand how these dots connect and how the government is actually responsible for many of the problems they're facing. You know, the reason college is so expensive is because the government got involved in student loan debt. The reason houses are so expensive is because of what the government did with the housing market, and also how the Federal Reserve keeps messing with your dollar. The reasons that you can't get ahead in your job, on and on the list goes, but really getting in and talking to them. And I think that's something that we don't often do as good of a job on. And I'll kind of include myself on the right in that for a minute, but I've worked for left-wing companies because I did a lot of criminal justice reform in my background. And I've seen what they do. And they have whole departments called outreach departments or organizing departments. And they'll have whole staff teams that are meant to go out and outreach to people and organize them and build coalitions. And we don't do that. We don't whip the grassroots like that. We don't go into the communities. We don't really seem to make an effort to talk to people who are not traditionally aligned with us or who are different than us. And I think that that's really, a huge missed opportunity because I think they could be. I don't think it's that I don't think it's that the younger generation is just so entrenched in, socialism or in progressivism. They just simply have not had alternative options presented to them.
You mentioned just now that you were in criminal justice. In what capacity?
So I got started in politics because I was in the music industry and I hated it. I don't know if you know that. I was in Nashville, hated music, was really ready to get out. And I was actually looking at going back to school to either be a lawyer or to be a therapist. I was kind of torn. So I started working on the side, sort of volunteering around both fields to try to pick. And on the legal side, I was working for a Second Amendment group and kind of got really entrenched in the public policy aspect of it. And then on the mental health side, I started volunteering for the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, which is a huge national group that does a lot of great work with the grassroots and mental health stuff, but they do a lot of lobbying as well. And they found I was doing some stuff in politics and they asked me if I would, do some lobbying pro bono. So I started working with them. They lean a bit left. So I was kind of picking and choosing which issues I would actually work on for them. And they came to me one day with the death penalty bill. And they wanted me to work on a bill that would exclude people with the most severe mental illnesses. So I'm talking schizophrenia, bipolar with psychosis from the death penalty. And I was like, oh, no, very pro death penalty. And they said, for people with mental illness? And I was like, yeah, like hardcore pro. And they said, but you hate the government. We've never met somebody who hates the government as much as you. You don't think the government can deliver the mail right, but you think they don't get it wrong when they kill people? I was like, well, I guess I've never thought about that way. So I started researching it, started looking into it more. Around that same time, Rand Paul, who I'm a huge, huge fan of, I've always been a huge fan of, he had introduced a criminal justice bill with Cory Booker. That got my attention. So I started researching a lot around criminal justice and totally changed my tune on it. I had no clue what I was talking about, had never been near the system. Like everything I thought was absolutely wrong. And so I got really hype on it. I did start working on that bill to exclude people with mental illness from the death penalty. I then went on to work for the Beacon Center of Tennessee, which is a free market think tank. And we did a lot of criminal justice around like reentry, workforce development, basically trying to fix some of the sentencing issues in the state. And then after that, I went and ran conservatives concerned about the death penalty at the national level for 3 years and overturned the death penalty in a state every year I was there. So that was really, really cool. That kind of got shut down when COVID happened because we were owned by a left-wing company and they would not let me travel and do my job. So, and now I'm in media. So it kind of ended up transitioning to that. But criminal justice reform has probably been at least one of my top two issues since I got into politics. I'm very, very passionate about it and continue to really, follow it very closely.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's been a big push for CJ reform over the last year or so. There are some good things about it. There's some bad things about it. Obviously, people who, just for an example, if you're sitting in jail and you've not been convicted of any crime, that's a problem. It's sort of un-American and anti-constitutional. At the same time, we have cities that are releasing criminals on the streets and we're seeing more crime. So how do you balance those two? What are the good things about CJ that you keep? What are the things that you change or get rid of?
Yeah, well, I think first and foremost, the cool thing about criminal justice reform is, especially leading up to the pandemic, we had about 15 years of incredible success across the states. It had largely been led by the right and kind of quietly, right? Like it wasn't really talked about, but you had a lot of right-wing groups like Right on Crime who had been advancing reforms and seeing incredible results. much lower recidivism rates, much lower costs. They'd been closing prisons, actually. They'd been restoring families. It was just really excellent what we saw happening. When the pandemic happened, all hell sort of broke loose. I think that one big problem you had was in 2020 in the riots, you had sort of I hate to put it this way, like the people who actually knew what they were talking about, the people who are like the working people that had done criminal justice reform, that were showing up to the table with real solutions, ready to talk about things. And then it kind of got hijacked by these Looney Tunes running around screaming, defund the police, and saying it's okay to burn businesses. And it ended up all sort of getting conflated under this criminal justice umbrella, which is really upsetting, and I think really hurt the movement and set it back pretty far, because the reality is left and right, the people who work on criminal justice reform, it's quite nuanced work, right? It's not this black and white thing. It's not an easy fix. There are a lot of components that go into crime. There are a lot of reasons that you have crime. It wasn't surprising to see an uptick in crime during the pandemic for a few reasons. One, most crime is committed by kids under the age 25 because your brain isn't fully formed. Your prefrontal cortex that's making your risk assessments and decisions, it's not fully there. And so we see a lot more crime committed by the age demographic. You shut down schools, you take away after school jobs, you leave them without economic income, you're going to get more petty crime. And that is exactly what happened. We saw a huge uptick in theft and car break-ins and robberies and that kind of thing. You also saw, I think, a big uptick in gangs and gang activity, because before the pandemic, you had a lot of services in cities that were actually pretty free market driven that I really liked. A lot of charities and nonprofits and churches that would come together and work with police and work hand in hand with other than law enforcement to have what they would have call call-ins, where they would try to do mitigating activities to dissipate bad relations within the gangs, to try to prevent people from retaliating against one another, to try to connect those young people with actual jobs and schools and opportunities. And so you would see a bit of a decrease in that activity. That went away. And then, of course, you did have some policies that went into place. I don't think this is largely what happened. I think this narrative has been a bit overblown, but I do think there are some places in California and New York that really got bail reform wrong. I'm a strong proponent of bail reform, but in order for bail reform to be successful, you have to have a good risk assessment tool. It has to be based on violence, right? And that's the bottom line. If you are charged with a crime, you should not be held for a long period of time before your trial, which is often the case, just because you're poor. The same thing should be true if you are violent and you might hurt somebody else. You shouldn't get to go out before your trial just because you can afford to pay. It should be based on whether or not you are a violent, ongoing risk to society. And if you're not, then you should be released and show up for your trial. And if you are, then you should not be put back out into society. They did not get their risk assessment tools right. Some of them did not even really have a strong risk assessment tool that they included in their legislation. And I think that that's some of the fallout that you've seen. And
real quick, where can everybody find you?
Well, the best place to find me is the website from our organization, which is base-politics.com. They can also find me at Hannah D. Cox on most platforms. I'm really active on Twitter and Facebook and TikTok and Instagram, so would love to connect with folks there.
Awesome. Thanks for joining me today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.